Here's what I've seen happen every time a service business tries to implement AI. They buy a tool, they spend a weekend setting it up, they go through the tutorial, they build a workflow that looks promising. It works well for about 2 weeks, sometimes a month if they are disciplined. Then it starts to slip. Someone on the team does not use it the right way. The output is inconsistent. The owner spends more time fixing the AI's work than they would have spent doing the task themselves. And eventually it becomes something nobody uses, and the owner goes back to doing things the same way they were doing them before, except now they have a $99 per month subscription reminding them that it did not work. I have worked inside professional services practices over the last 2 years. Accounting firms, consulting practices, agencies, financial advisory groups. Every single one had either tried an AI tool and given up, or was actively being pitched something new that they did not understand yet. Some of them had tried 3 or 4 tools, different categories, different vendors, same result. And what I noticed was that they kept diagnosing the wrong problem. The diagnosis was almost always some version of, we did not use it enough, or we need to train the team better, or we need a different tool with different features, so they would try again. New tool, same outcome. I want to tell you why that cycle keeps happening, because it is not what most people think. The problem is not the tool. The problem is that most businesses are trying to automate tasks before they have built the infrastructure that makes automation possible. Think about what you are actually trying to do when you implement AI in a service business. You are trying to take a process that currently requires human judgment, human context, human memory, human relationships, and you are trying to hand it off to a system that can execute it consistently without you being in the room. But here is the question no one is asking. Where does that judgment live right now? In most service businesses, it lives in the owner's head. The rules for how decisions get made, who gets priority, how you handle a difficult client situation, what the exceptions are, when you bend the process and when you do not, none of that is written down anywhere. The context someone would need to execute a process correctly, the history with specific clients, the nuance in how a particular deliverable is supposed to be positioned, the unwritten standards that separate good work from great work. That context is not in a document, it is not in a system, it is in a person, and you cannot automate a person's head. When you hand that kind of task to an AI tool, you are handing an intern a project with no brief, no context, no examples of what good looks like, and no way to ask clarifying questions. Of course the output is wrong. Of course the process breaks down. The AI is not the problem. The absence of infrastructure is the problem. This is what I call the cognitive capital problem. Cognitive capital is the knowledge your business runs on, not the expertise you sell, the operating intelligence underneath it, the decision frameworks, the client context, the understanding of how your work actually gets done at the standard you have built a reputation for. The judgment calls you make 50 times a week without even recognizing them as decisions. Right now, in most service businesses, that capital is locked inside 1 or 2 people's heads. It is not portable, it is not transferable, it is not documented, and it is definitely not automatable. When that capital stays locked inside a person, every time that person leaves the room, the quality goes with them. You cannot train someone else to do the work the right way because the right way lives entirely in one person's memory. You cannot build consistent processes because the process is whatever the owner decides it is in the moment. You cannot scale the operation because scaling requires repeatability, and nothing about this is repeatable. And you cannot use AI because there is nothing for the AI to execute against. The businesses that are actually succeeding with AI implementation are not the ones who found a better tool. They are the ones who did the infrastructure work first. They extracted the cognitive capital from the owner's head. They documented the processes, not the high-level summaries, but the actual decision trees, the actual standards, the actual criteria for when one approach applies versus another. They built the operational layer that makes their business understandable to something that is not a human being. That work is not glamorous, it is not fast. But here is what I have seen it produce. When the processes are documented and the decision frameworks are explicit and the context is externalized into a system that can be referenced consistently, the AI has something to work with. Now it is not guessing, it is executing against a clear set of instructions with clear standards and clear context. The output is consistent because the input is complete. The system is improvable because you can see exactly where it is breaking down and go fix that specific part rather than abandoning the whole approach. And the owner stops being the only person who can run the business correctly. That is the real value of AI implementation done right, not the automation itself, though that matters. The value is that the work of building infrastructure for AI forces you to extract the knowledge that was always one resignation or one medical emergency away from disappearing. What the infrastructure work actually involves, practically, is a process of making decisions visible. When you watch an experienced owner run their business, what looks like intuition is actually a decision tree they have internalized so completely that it no longer registers as deliberate thought. Which client do you chase this week? How do you know when someone needs a more assertive update versus patience? When do you bring in a second opinion versus trusting your own read? These are not instincts. They are learned frameworks that got compressed into gut feeling over years of experience. Externalizing them, writing them down with enough specificity that something other than you can execute against them, is not as complicated as it sounds once you know what you are looking for. But it requires slowing down a process that currently runs at full speed. It requires someone asking you to walk through a decision you made automatically and explain each turn. That is the work. And when it is done, what you have built is not just an AI-ready operation. You have built the thing that makes hiring easier, delegation possible, and training faster, regardless of whether you ever touch an AI tool again. The documentation is an asset completely independent of the automation it enables. I have talked to owners who went through this process and told me afterward that they did not realize how fragile their business was until they started writing things down. Everything lived in their head. Everything depended on them being available, being well, being present. The infrastructure work was uncomfortable because it made that visible. But it was also the first time their business could exist as something separate from their constant involvement. Here's what I want you to take from this. First, if you have ever tried to implement AI in your business and it did not work, if the tool sat unused, if the output was too inconsistent, if the team never adopted it, it was almost certainly not the tool's fault. The infrastructure was not ready for it. You tried to automate a process that had never been documented. Of course it failed. Any tool would have failed in the same conditions. Second, the work you do before the AI goes in. The process documentation, the decision mapping, the context extraction, the standards definition, that work has value completely independent of the AI. Businesses with documented processes outperform businesses without them regardless of the technology they are using. The AI just makes the absence of documentation visible faster than anything else has before. What it is actually revealing is a problem that was always there. Third, the service businesses that are going to be structurally difficult to compete with in 3 years are not the ones who bought the best AI tools. They are the ones who built the best AI infrastructure. Those are different things. The tools are available to everyone. Anyone can subscribe to the same products you can. The infrastructure is proprietary, the documented processes, the decision frameworks, the operational layer that makes consistent execution possible, that takes time and effort to build, and it cannot be purchased. It has to be built. And the businesses building it now are going to have an advantage that is very difficult to catch up to later. The window for this is not unlimited. At some point, the businesses that made this investment early are going to be so far ahead operationally that the gap closes. Not because the tools got harder to access, but because the compounding of consistent, documented, AI-assisted execution over 2 or 3 years produces results that cannot be replicated by starting later. There are businesses in your market right now doing exactly this work, quietly, without announcing it. Not because they are ahead of the technology is available to everyone, but because they understood that the technology only works when the infrastructure underneath it is built correctly, and they made that investment before they needed to.